Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. It really is great to be back with you again this week. And I thought this week we'd have a look at UFOs in lonely places. And in Australia, there really is that opportunity. Being a very large and basically fairly empty continent for the most part, there is plenty of places for UFOs to make an appearance. And often they do choose to appear in the places where there are not many people. And perhaps that's for their own reasons. And I've just been through looking at records and things, and I've just found many, many examples of this. And we're also going to have a look at another sort of aspect of the phenomenon, and that is UFOs stealing things, which I think is quite an interesting phenomenon as well. They are quite famous for pinching stuff off us. So we're going to have a bit of a look at that. And that sort of evolved in this episode as I was doing my research. I thought, well, they are thieves. They like to take things. So we're going to have a look at that. And I thought we'd start this week's episode with a rather interesting and probably not that well-known incident that occurred over Lake Eyre. Now, Lake Eyre is a very large salt lake, basically, one of the largest in the world. And I'm going to show you where that location is. It's here. So for those of you who don't know Australia, Lake Eyre is a big salt pan located in northeastern South Australia, where that little red drop pin is. And as you can see, talking about lonely places, that is indeed a hot, dry, and lonely place. So, and this image here might give you a bit more of an idea, a bit closer. So there you go. It's basically, there's not a lot of what you would call green vegetation out in that area. And it's quite famous in Australia, Lake Eyre. And so what happened out there? So there was a man called Lewis Bryce, and he had a special job, or he had a job, it was that special, but he had a job flying tourists out over Lake Eyre. And in 1979, he saw and captured on film an astonishing spectacle, a spectacle that would haunt him for many, many years. And he was taking passengers on a scenic tour. And when they passed over the lake's southeastern corner, he noticed a huge clock-faced shaped pattern in the water. And the whole thing was breathtaking in its size and in its configuration. It consisted of a central mound and a series of smaller mounds in a circle. And around it, it looked like heaps of sand in pink water. And he didn't have the slightest clue as to what it was. And nor did any of his sightseers who had joined him on the plane, on his aircraft. And he was so intrigued that he turned around and he flew back into the area, and he was unable to find the clock face again. And he managed to take a photograph of it. which was really good that he was able to do that. Whenever we get photographs and videos, it's not the whole story, but it helps to support an encounter if you have it. And in this particular case, it is interesting because it's not like he just took a photo of the sky and snapped something that could have been a bird or a cloud or any other plane or anything like that. This is really a big pattern in the water, because Lake Eyre does actually has a rain season. So without turning this episode into a David Attenborough National Geographic episode, it does get rains when the sort of the monsoonal rains pass through. So he sent his photo off to a UFO researcher in South Australia called Jeff Findlay, and he theorised that the marks were caused by the terrific pressure of something taking off. And Jeff Findlay formulated his theory in the context of numerous airborne discs and spheres that had been seen close to Lake Eyre over the decades. Yeah, so you can see it's not just this one encounter. There's other supporting cases around that area. So let's have a look at the photo. I know I'm dying to see it, so I'll bring it up for you to have a look at as well. So this is the photo that he took of the water below as he flew over in his sightseeing plane with the passengers on board. So that is definitely a circle and evenly spaced lights that appear to be in the water, or like mounds as he described them to be. So very, very unusual. So maybe it's up there with crop circles. Maybe it's something to do along those lines. But to my knowledge, this is the only photograph that exists of the phenomenon that occurred out in Lake Eyre. And if we go back and have a look again, that this is the area that we're talking about, right out there in the middle of literally nowhere. That's where it was. And further support to Lewis's incident was from a lady who testified that 3 weeks after that photo was taken, that a moon-shaped object had terrorized her and her son and daughter. The lady's name was Beverly Schumann of a place called Bambera, and she said that they were driving home along the Flinders Ranges, south of the lake. And I'm going to show you another one to give you that perspective. So Lake Eyre's up to the north of the photo, and in the center of that photo, there's a mountain range running down. So just south of Lake Eyre is the Flinders Ranges location. So they were driving home along the Flinders Ranges south of the lake when a brilliant yellow light suddenly rushed towards them. And it was shaped like the moon, but much bigger and brighter. And she got the feeling that the object was about to land on the road. And she was so scared and tried to swing the car around. But halfway into the turn, the engine stopped because we're in the presence of this bright moon-like object. And so when the engine stopped and it wouldn't start again, they weren't about to sit there. So her and her children jumped out of the car and ran away. So I don't know the old adage of don't abandon your ship, but she couldn't turn the car around. The car had stopped and wouldn't start again as this object was coming near them, and they got out and they started to run. And another driver, a lady called Anita Lindbaum of a town called Hawker, she backed up the story, and she passed Beverly's car, which was parked across the road at a strange angle. And further along, she saw Beverly and the kids running in obvious panic. The children were so scared, and they were clawing at Anita's car door, trying to get in. And Anita also saw this light, which she described as resembling a much bigger version of the moon. And Anita drove Beverly back to her car, which started immediately at the point the object decided to leave the area. So that's quite a dramatic incident, just south of Lake Eyre, 3 weeks after that photograph was taken. You know, you've got mothers and children running from cars as strange objects appear in the sky, and a good Samaritan happens to pick them up, maybe before the UFO did. So rather dramatic story, and one that I've never heard of before. So this is what I love about doing Unexplained Phenomena Australia, is I'm finding a lot of stuff that I've never heard of. as I go around digging through whatever I can find in the paranormal world. So, and that's really quite a good incident. I reckon someone should make a little video of that because, people's cars stalling and kids running and everything. It's just, it's really, really interesting. So, and in 2001, so remember this is 1979, so it's a fair while ago, that the British newspapers published a remarkable photograph that showed a similar gigantic configuration of more than 400 crop circles in a Wiltshire wheat field. And investigators noted that the shot bears a startling resemblance in shape and dimensions to the pattern of the one photographed in Lake Eyre. But I don't actually have that picture. I tried to find it, but I couldn't find it. But we'll take it for their word that there was a crop circle that had a similar appearance to the Lake Eyre one, to this photo here again. So it's a very interesting, and you look at it and you can see it's obviously an organised thing that has a very geometric shape to it. So, it doesn't seem like a random nature event. But I'm not saying that it's not. It is what it is, and we don't know what it was. Now, so there you go. Lake Eyre, very remote place. You can't really, it's right up there as far as remote places in the world go. And now I'm going to talk about another interesting incident that I found, which occurred at a water plant. So a water plant is where they obviously process water to make it drinkable for a local community. And this one was up in Queensland, and I'm going to show you now. And the water plant itself is it's in a little sort of a fairly remote area, the actual water plant. And so where that little dropper is there shows you the location. So I think it was north of Brisbane. So it's just up there on the coast, right up there. And this is a view above the actual plant itself. So there you go. So you can see this particular water treatment plant is located along a tributary, and it's in a fairly densely wooded area. Perfect for UFOs to make an appearance. And a gentleman called Alan Domachence, people have such difficult surnames, Domachence was working night shift at the Teddington Water Treatment Facility in Maryborough, Queensland. And at 3:15 a.m., which is definitely well past the witch's hour, while he was walking past the plant's southern window, he saw a circular wheel-like object, quite enormous, moving through the sky outside. And simultaneously, all the lights failed, and he quickly discovered that all the water plant systems went dead as well. So this object stopped an entire water plant. It ceased all electrical activity in the water plant, lighting and everything. And he could hardly believe that this could happen. And the circuits could usually be tested 3 times before the power dropped off entirely. But the power in the entire plant along that little river there went dead. And he was the only person in the building, sort of a bit of a night watchman kind of a role. And he was very frightened. But he did go outside, and he was amazed to see that everything was bathed in a brilliant white light. The whole southern side of the nearby pine plantation was lit up so dazzlingly that the outline of every tree was visible. And the circular object had apparently changed. It was now a massive white light spinning above the forest. And he stood staring at it for a few minutes until suddenly it just went out. And simultaneously, in the plant behind him, all the power came back on. And in daylight, he checked the pine plantation for clues. And in the long grass, he found a dark brown scorched ring, about 15 meters in diameter. So the circle lay directly beneath the power lines. And he was initially hesitant to share his encounter. But gradually he'd learned that large numbers of people have had such encounters. So, and one case that he'd heard of was a man who was travelling regularly from Alice Springs in Central Australia When he made his trip, his car runs out of power and stops in exactly the same place, although the man never saw anything. So Alan thought that this might have been related to what experience he'd had at the water plant, as in loss of power. So, and this is the water plant itself. I got onto Google and did a Google search of it, and you can see that it's in a fairly remote sort of an area. So that was the plant, and here this is that shot again. So this object's appeared above the plant, or in the vicinity of the plant, and then it's moved off over the forest, lit up the entire area, and you've got an entire water plant not operating. So interesting. These are the stories you don't hear about, aren't they? Like, just these really great things that occur out there. It's a fairly dramatic event, really. And I've never seen it in a documentary. I've never really read about it widely in anything. So that makes it very interesting. So we're going to move along now to another really interesting and strange encounter, which has a fair bit going on in it, really, because this is a camping trip, and camping trips are fun, and this one sort of has a couple of strange things occur again in Queensland. So Queenslander Bob Terrellison worked for many years as an ambulance driver, and in his spare time he'd love to go camping. And he had a strange encounter with a friend in the Eyre Gorge region, about 4 hours west of Bundaberg. So I'm going to show you where that is. Where are we? So this is the Eyre Gorge. So the Eyre Gorge is here. So you can see where that little blue dropper is. So we're kind of sort of semi-inland in Queensland above Brisbane there. And this is Bob himself. So there he is. So he was a rather experienced bushman and knew the area very well and spent a lot of time out there. So, and he had this strange encounter with a friend, and that gorge is about 4 hours drive west of Bundaberg. And the gorge is located just north of the abandoned Gold Mile mine near Krakow, not the Polish Krakow, and different spelling. The section he and his friend visited is 300 feet deep and more than a mile wide in dry times, and a series of water holes in the wet. And the Dawson River is a rushing torrent that flows through that area during the wet season. And they often abseiled down the gorge's sheer face to explore the dry riverbed. And they usually only ever found kangaroo prints and pig wallows and other animal traces. But one night, things got a little strange, and it was about 9 p.m. and they had just crawled into their tents when his friend Alan had to go to the toilet. And in the meantime, Bob was twisting uncomfortably, trying to fit into a patch of ground within the rocks where his tent was, when Alan suddenly let out a terrified scream. Bob, get out of here quickly. And Bob grabbed his shotgun and ran outside. And Alan was standing on the ravine's edge and gesticulating towards the floor of the gorge. And there, 300 feet below, was a huge mass of coloured lights. And the mass was just that, with no defined shape. And the strange light show seemed to be alive, and the lights were squirming and changing position with astonishing speed. There was no noise, no heat, just the lights swarming in a way that neither Bob nor Alan had seen before. And as they watched, this mass of lights, which was the size of a house, they described, slowly moved across the sandy floor of the gorge, heading west, gradually picked up speed and began to rise into the air. And soon it was a receding blur in the western sky, and then it was gone. And neither man slept well that night. So I'm going to show you a couple of images of Eyre Gorge, just to give you a bit more of an understanding of it. So that's the area from a satellite image. So you can see it's quite a heavy and thick wooded area, a remote area, as we're talking about, quiet, lonely places. So this is a quiet and lonely place. And a couple of photos to give you a bit more of a feel as to what that environment is like. And as you can see, it really does have its own feel to it, its own sort of a vibe, as these areas do. And another photo here with a little stone tower that someone's made, which I sort of liked, and another image there. So you can see it's not sort of terrain that you can walk through easily. It's got high cliffs and a very, very treed, wooded, let's use the word wooded area. So if that's not a good enough, that's a pretty good experience, isn't it? You're out camping, you're at the top of this big gorge, 300 feet below. There's a massive swirling lights down there, moving and swirling, and the thing takes up and off it goes, you know. And we don't have fireflies in Australia, so if you're sort of thinking it's that type of thing or bioluminescence of birds, it's no. It's none of those sorts of explanations. So this was a strange thing, but that's not the end of their experience. There's more. There's more. The men decided to go to another area further west along the old Cobb and Coach Road, which was overgrown by small timber and forest bushes, and some sections of the road are still evident in the form of corrugations over swampy ground, where logs were laid down to create a firm footing for the horses and the coach wheels. So they're going deeper into the wilderness after having that experience. Some people might be spooked and have rushed out of there after seeing mysterious lights, but not these guys. They were intrepid. So it was near one of these creek crossings that another mystery presented itself. They'd pitched camp and were settling down to a hot meal when they heard the sound of an Aboriginal bull roarer, which is a thing the Aboriginals used to spin in the air, and it created a bit of a roaring sound. So they could hear this. So they described as being like a Aboriginal bull roarer, and the sound was coming from the creek from their left. And they looked at each other, and as far as they knew, there were no tribal Aboriginals living in the area. And the haunting sound grew louder, and it started to give the men the shivers. There was no wind at all, and the trees were still, and nothing was moving. And so Bob grabbed his shotgun and a spotlight and jumped into the sandy creek bed. The moment he shone the light up the creek, the sound stopped. And when he extinguished his light, the sound began again. He did this 3 times. When he lit up the chasm, the sound would stop, turn off the light, and the bull roaring sound started again. Weird. And so the men packed up their gear and they went to a higher spot about a mile away. And the next morning, in bright sunlight, they were braver and returned to the original camping spot. And fully armed, they went upstream to see what the sound source might have been. And they walked for 2 hours, checking the sand for footprints and other signs of habitation. But they found absolutely nothing at all. And that evening, they settled into another camping spot. This is the second night, a little away from the creek as storm clouds were gathering. And before they started their evening meal, they saw a big boar, a big pig, ambling through the forest. And while Alan held the spotlight, Bob fired the shot, echoing through the night. And the moment he pulled the trigger, the most blood-curdling scream came directly from behind them. And it was so shatteringly loud, it seemed only feet away from them. And Alan was the first to recover and spun the spotlight around, noting there was nothing but the night, and it was still no movement, no breeze, the trees, no breeze in the trees, nothing. So, and Bob reflected on the scream being high-pitched, like nothing they'd heard before. And they had no idea what could have emitted it, this sound, this horrible blood-curdling scream. And they spent hours the following day exploring but found nothing. And the mystery of the lights and the scream and the bull-roaring sound out at the Eyre Gorge continues to this day. So they didn't know what it was. But what a camping trip. I want that camping trip. That's just great. Every time I go camping, nothing happens. But that's a really good example of strange activity occurring in a remote and lonely place. So we'll move on to the next one. So many examples. It's just talk for hours about this, and probably will over coming weeks. So in 1972, a gentleman called Rodney Jarvis, or let's call him Rod Jarvis, was employed on an oil rig, and he'd been enjoying a few days of leave in Darwin, but he had to return to his job on a 6 a.m. flight. And so for those of you who don't know where Darwin is, there it is. There's a map of Australia. And Darwin's right up in the very top point there. So in the top of the Northern Territory, pretty famous place. Most people, well, a lot of people should know where that is. And this incident occurred here. So this is Darwin itself. And in the middle of that photo, this is the Darwin Airport, a place that I've been to. So that's where this occurred. So he had to return to work after a few days off, and he had to catch the 6 a.m. flight. And being a heavy sleeper, he feared he'd miss the connecting flight, and a friend offered to drive him to the airport the evening before the trip. And they were going to sleep in the car. Doesn't sound very appealing, but that's what they did. And Rod slept uncomfortably that night, as you'd expect, in the car's front seat. And Fred was on the back seat, probably had the better deal. At about 4:45 a.m., Rod awoke with a sore neck. And looking out of the car window, Rod saw a very large, slow-moving orange light, about the size of half a house, is how he described it, skimming across the top of some nearby rooftops. And it was like a squashed ball, grey on its upper side and the underside glowing brilliantly orange. And Rod awoke Fred, and they both left the car for a closer look. And they realised the object was zigzagging towards them. And it was going about 200 metres to the right and 200 metres to the left. And Rod wanted a better view. And he turned the car's lights on, at which point the object stopped overhead. Fred was terrified, and he ran under the eaves of a nearby building. But Rod thought this was the opportunity of a lifetime, and he decided to communicate with the object. He knew limited Morse code, and he knew 4 letters, the letters being G, S, F, and O, which doesn't spell much, but have a go. And he flashed those letters in Morse code with the car's lights. And each sequence was flashed back at him a few seconds later. And Fred was yelling at him to run, but Rod stayed put. And he decided he'd have a go at communicating further. He walked into the full glare of the headlights. I can see all this as a movie, right? And he thought he could try and send an ESP message. And he reached up with his hands, indicating that he was trying to communicate. So he's put his hands up, having a go. And in his mind, he said, "Don't be afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you. Come down. I want to meet you." But that moment was spoilt when a car pulled up bearing 2 airport officials. And they were angry, very mad, asking what he was doing flashing his lights at an international airport. He pointed up and said, "Look at that," and flashed 2 more letters, which was replied by the object. And then the object no longer responded. It went straight up, did a huge leap over the horizon, and was gone. This is hovering low over the Darwin airport. And the airport officials basically said, "Don't do it again," and returned to their car and drove off. And that was the basic extent of the experience. But here you've got an international airport, which Darwin is, and lots of planes come out of Asia flying into Darwin, and this object's hovering low over, and it's responding to Morse code flashes of the car's headlights. That's a relatively, I won't say common, but it's not unheard of. But it's an interesting aspect of the UFO phenomenon that you've got these objects will on occasion respond to flashing and indicating. And obviously the Reverend Gill one comes to mind in New Guinea when they saw that object come down over the mission, and they were waving at the beings on the craft and they waved back. So very interesting case. So that's another interesting little encounter. So now we're going to go back to the outback south of Darwin. And we're going to go to a location called the Great Sandy Desert here. So you can see where Darwin was to the north of that picture there, and where that little red drop dot is, that's the Great Sandy Desert. And as you can expect, with a name like that, that's exactly what it is. It's a Great Sandy Desert, and more specifically in the Kununarra area here, where that little, you might be able to see it. There's a bit of a red area on that picture that's traced out just below the Gulf there. That's the Kununarra area. And I must say, I've not been there yet, but one day it'd be lovely to go up there. Lots of people go up there, take their caravans and go camping and all that sort of stuff. So it'd be hard to be there by yourself, I guarantee you that, even though it's a lonely place. But this is interesting because in this area, this is a story or two stories, a tale of two people who disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. And in 1977, a motorist disappeared without trace in the Great Sandy Desert near the Northern Territory border with Western Australia. And 2 years later, a second motorist went missing in the same area, almost under identical circumstances. So in the 1977 case, a man staying at a motel in the area failed to report in. And Police Sergeant Tom Corker, the Kununarra policeman, set up a search. And the man's car was found abandoned at Golden Gate Creek. And Tom brought in Aboriginal trackers, and they could find no signs, markings, footprints leading from the car. And it got odder because on the night the man disappeared, Mains Road employees, guys who work on the roads, who were in a bush camp, had reported seeing strange lights in the sky. So that's really strange. And this guy was never found again. Now I tried to find that Golden Gate Creek, and it was not easy to do because often without local knowledge, things aren't signposted necessarily. So I did my absolute best and probably spent about 20 minutes trying to track it down. And this is as close as I could find, ring around this area. So this is what it sort of looks like in that general vicinity. So you do get a bit of an idea that that's what the area is like. Hot, you can be guaranteed of that. So the second event in 1979 was very similar. Another broken down vehicle was found on the same road, and the driver had simply gone. No clues, no footprints. He was just never located. And on the night he disappeared, some tribal Aboriginals camped on the road said they had seen spirit lights in the sky. And the UFO reports in the area are constant. And the locals know that from time to time, something strange is going on. So 5 years before the world had heard of the Knowles family, many people around Kununarra were talking and writing about bizarre aerial objects that had swooped on their cars. So, and one such example was of a guy called Damien Monk, M-O-N-C-K, who was a plant operator, so like bulldozers and things like that. And he had been driving along the Darwin-Broome Highway about 70 kilometres from Kununarra. And suddenly a bright round object appeared and began to keep pace with the car. And Damien and his passengers, who was Karen Newton and her 7-year-old son, were worried that they were all getting bad vibes, and the feeling that the object was menacing them. Damien sped up, hoping to leave the object behind. Then at last it began to lose interest in them, and Karen and James watched as it vanished behind hills about 30 kilometres outside Kununarra. So it started chasing him at about the 70 kilometres from Kununarra, and it chased him for about 40 kilometres along the road. That's a fairly significant trip. And this is the exact area, because I sort of got onto being the avid Google Maps searcher that I am, got onto Google Maps, and I had a look and went about approximately 70 kilometres to the east of Kununarra, and it was in this area here. So as you can see, lonely location, nothing but a road out there, and flat environment. So that's really a strange encounter. And so also 7 years before the Knowles family, I spoke about the Knowles family incident on a previous episode. That's when their car got lifted off the road on the Nullarbor Plain, very famous Australian case. And we won't go into it too much because I've got too much to go through as it is. But these cases kind of support that Knowles family case. So 7 years before the Knowles family, Robin White of Kelso in Queensland endured a fairly similar incident. She was driving to Toowoomba from Jondarran at 4:30. A brilliantly lit object appeared from nowhere and swooped down over her pickup truck. And then it ascended and hovered, and she was scared out of her wits. But she stopped and got out to have a look, and she noticed there was no bounce back or reflection of the light. The pickup truck had a shiny tailgate, but no light appeared in the object. And the object was brilliantly lit up, and it was self-contained. No trees were illuminated either. Feeling uneasy, Robin returned to her car and began to drive off. And to her dismay, the object began following her again. And as she sped up, so did the object. At last, she saw Toowoomba ahead, and the object disappeared. And she was shaken but intensely relieved. So this was the area of her encounter. So and it's quite a common report that these are brightly lit objects. So you can see that's in Queensland where she was driving. So these objects are brightly lit, really bright. You can't miss them, but they don't reflect any light. So there's no shadows cast. Very interesting is that little report. And a gentleman called Ken Smith of Yass in the Australian Capital Territory on the 13th of June 1993 was driving from Golgong to Gunning at dusk, and he stopped at a place called Black Creek to eat some sandwiches and drink coffee on his trip. And obviously, it was drinking out of his thermos. It was dark, and when he finished his meals, he drove on, and he noticed something was clinging to his glasses and obscuring his view of the road. And he stopped to wipe the lens clean, and that's when the horror began. As he sat on the deserted road, he heard a sound like scratching against metal, and then he felt something grip the rear of the car and lift it up. Ken could see nothing through the rear window, but something, whatever it was, lifted the car's rear 4 times before dropping it back on the road. And Ken backed out of there and drove away as fast as he could. And a little further on, he felt a shiver run right through him, and he knew he was being watched. And at that point, the road went into a culvert and swung to the right. And that's when Ken saw a very bright green light or green object about the size. He described about the size of a fox's eye, so that sort of distance, hovering about 45 centimeters from the road, from the ground. And Ken had very bright 150-watt driving lights, and if there'd been anything more than a tiny light, he would have seen it easily. But the only thing visible was this green object. And as Ken drove on, it kept moving to the left of the car, and Ken's sense of being watched persisted. And he'd done a lot of spotlighting and noted that if an animal turns its head, you lose sight of it. But this weird light stayed in view all the time, and he was in no doubt that the object was close by until it eventually decided to go away, but it actually lifted his car off the ground. Now, I also had a look at that location, and that's here. So this is in New South Wales, and so Google gives you 3 potential routes, and let's assume he was probably going down the most obvious one, which is the shortest distance. So again, you're out there in the middle of New South Wales, out there in a dark, quiet, and lonely place, and his car was lifted off the ground 4 times. Rather dramatic, like the Knowles family case Here's another case that supports that particular incident. So as poorly treated as the Knowles family was back in 1988 at the time of their encounter, here's another case that supports a car being lifted off the road in Australia. So very interesting. Just take that map down. So it just continues. It just goes on and on and on. You'd think these things were appearing daily over here, but all these reports have come over a long time, and I'm finding lots of interesting things to discuss. So here is another one: terror on the Nullarbor Plain. In 1990, a gentleman called Peter Ellicott, who was 26 and a machinist, so I imagine that means lathes and that sort of thing, he experienced a near fatal encounter while crossing the Nullarbor Plain. And he was returning from a holiday, and it was just after dusk, and he was driving down the Madura Pass, and the sky was overcast, but stars were visible between the clouds. In the distance, he noticed what seemed to be two lights of a car parked on the road ahead. And as he drew closer, he saw they were actually hovering. These lights were hovering about 5 meters above the ground. And Peter had a sudden rush of adrenaline as he realized that it could be a UFO. And he stepped on the accelerator and drove straight at the lights. And they seemed to respond immediately by raising about 10 meters above the road. And then they sped away from his advancing car, matching Peter's speed, but staying about 15 meters ahead at all times. Peter flashed his lights, and in response, the two lights split into three lights. And Peter switched on his hazard lights, and immediately the lights formed themselves into a triangle. So when he switched on his hazard lights, the three lights formed a triangle. And Peter drove slowly towards them, but suddenly they flew towards him with lightning speed. Peter panicked and did a 180-degree turn and headed west, back the other direction. The lights chased him, and in desperation to escape, he sped up to 190 kilometers an hour. But he couldn't shake these three lights behind him. He was so scared he began praying out loud. But then, out of the distance, a truck appeared coming towards him. And as the truck drew closer, the triangle of lights peeled off and disappeared. And at the local bar in Madura, Peter shared his experience, and no one was skeptical. No one. They all listened intently, and they told him that there had been many similar incidents in the area. So I'm going to give you a bit of an idea where that was. So this here. So that's also in the middle of nowhere. So over onto the left side of that picture, you've got Perth, Western Australia, Albany, all that area down there, which is the bottom green tinged area of Western Australia. And then moving across the Nullarbor Plain, where that red dropper is, that's where he had his encounter. And the Knowles family encounter was also similarly in that area, a little bit further along. So there certainly is things happening out there, and I would love to cross that Nullarbor Plain at night. I think it would be amazing to do that. And so other sorts of similar things happened, and this one here is really amazing. I didn't find a lot of information on it, but I found a report that this actually did happen. So in January 1985, two train drivers claimed they were followed across the Nullarbor Plain by a mysterious object. They said it drained their train of power, bringing it to a halt. So this is the image that comes to mind with that for me. So out there above the Nullarbor Plain, being followed by a UFO, and the train comes to a halt. We've got water plants coming to a halt. We've got trains coming to a halt. Cars. It's just amazing. So, and in July 1984, in the Adelaide Hills in South Australia, farmers discovered 4 cows with holes drilled into their skulls and brains extracted, and police found burns and egg-shaped pod marks in the soil. And investigators also found crushed rocks, burnt trees, and dozens of dead birds in the area. In December 1987, a Tasmanian businessman said an egg-shaped object landed on the road at 10:30 p.m. And as it did so, his engine and his lights died. He panicked and ran to take cover in the bushes, and the car was dragged towards the light before the object flew off. and the man returned to his car to find it covered in grey dust. So, interesting things. So we're going to have a quick change now because we're starting to run out of time. We're going to look at UFOs stealing things. So, what do UFOs steal? Well, the first one that comes to mind is water. And we spoke about the Rosedale case a few episodes ago where the water tank was drained of 10,000 gallons of water in an instant by a UFO. Now, just down the road, and that's only an hour from where I live, and just down the road from that area, another little place, about a year later, on another farm, they had a billabong there, which is like a body of water. And the farmer, William Dingwall, came out and he'd found 4 perfectly burnt circles on the ground next to the billabong, and the billabong had been drained of water. So, so 4 6-meter rings next to the ground. And I've been to that farm, found where that farm is, and it's just outside a little town, really close by. And also nearby, but closer to the coast, this is in Victoria. All this is in Victoria where I am. Stan Barker, a dairy farmer of Seaspray, discovered 3 scorched rings 6 meters across, similar to the ones at Bundalagua, near a water trough on his property. And the cows, or the heifers, were so scared of the rings they would not go near them. And at the similar time, on the other side of the country, residents of Mount Magnet, Western Australia, in July 1980, reported seeing flashing blue lights in the sky. And the next morning, 59,000 litres of water were missing from a local farmer's tank. And a Mrs. Mary Thomas of Silkwood, Queensland, so gone from Victoria to Western Australia and now up to Queensland, in 1982 actually saw a UFO taking water one morning at 1 a.m. She awoke when her son-in-law got up to use the toilet, and he called, "Mum, what do you think that is?" And Mary went outside to where he was, and they saw a huge craft shaped like a saucer hovering above the creek that ran through the back garden. And the UFO was ringed with red and green lights. And astonishingly, it seemed to be standing on a thick wall of water. And as their eyes adjusted to the dark, they could see that the UFO was actually sucking up the water from the creek. And they watched it for about 30 minutes as it continued to suck up water. And the water was drawn up as if attracted by a magnet. And finally, the craft began to spin and then shot away towards Cairns in far north Queensland. And although the UFO was described as large, Mary could not believe that it could take up so much water. So there you go. They steal water. They also steal fruit, interestingly enough. And orchardists, this is in Warrnambool in Victoria, in the state I'm in, but it's on the other side of the state. So I'm in the east, and Warrnambool's in the west of Victoria, right over. It's about a 6-hour drive from here. So it's not going to happen anytime soon for me to go there. So there's a few orchards where they grew apples, and the orchardists were at a loss to explain what was stealing their fruit. A market gardener called John Dart lost huge quantities of apples overnight, and Jeff and Shirley Flynn, his neighbours, awoke to find 56 apple trees had been stripped overnight. There were not even any apples left on the ground. And the following night, the Flynn's neighbour, Peter Hulman, found his trees had been stripped bare as well. And he said that he had a Doberman and a Rottweiler, dogs that were guarding his farm, and he couldn't understand how the thieves could have gotten in and out without being attacked. On John Dart's property, the mystery continued when one morning he came out and found 7 trees cleared from top to bottom and 10 trees left intact. 2 of his trees stood side by side, and one was completely stripped of all apples, and the other tree was fully laden with apples. So whatever this mysterious thief takes, it takes everything from the surrounding grass, including rotten apples. And the biggest mystery was whoever was taking these apples knew quality, and they only went for the best trees. And the thieves are capable of removing huge amounts of apples quickly. And another neighbour awoke to find 90 apple trees stripped bare overnight. And that would have taken about 15 men with torches and ladders. And there was no footprints around the trees. There was no impressions of ladder marks in the ground. These trees have been stripped bare, absolutely stripped bare. So, and you could say fruit bats, but fruit bats would leave, claws and remains, and you'd hear them chitter chattering in the trees. And so it hasn't been fruit bats. Whole orchards have been taken, and selective parts of orchards where the better apples were. Now, what else do they take? UFOs take fish. So 15,000 rainbow trout and Chinook salmon were missing from Lake Bulleen Merry near Camperdown in Western Victoria. This is over where Warrnambool is. And these disappearances disturbed the fisheries greatly. They did 3 extensive netting surveys, and there's not a trace of any of the fish, 15,000 fish. And also what was odd, that none of them had washed up on the shore. And the lake was one of Victoria's most productive fishing areas, attracting nearly 5,000 anglers a year. But for a 2-month period, it was completely emptied and no catches were recorded at all. So all the fish had gone missing. 15,000 fish, all the apples gone from the orchards. And additionally, what else do they take? They take pineapples. So Harry Roy of Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland discovered that 15,000 pineapples had been snatched, and he was in no doubt that who had done it. He blamed the UFOs. And he was working near his homestead one afternoon when the earth was shaken by a series of loud thumps. And thinking that an earthquake had happened, he went over to his brother's house, Gordon, to ensure that he was okay. And Gordon said that he too had heard the noises and thought that it had come from the back of the farm. And when they went to that area, they saw that 15,000 pineapples, pineapple tops that they had prepared, were missing. And there was no road into that area. You couldn't drive into that area. And not even a helicopter could get in there undetected. And Harry was in no doubt that the UFOs had taken them. And he said that UFOs took whatever they liked from farms in the area. So obviously they just didn't take pineapples. They took all manner of things. And they were known to steal from water from dams as well. So that's no surprise. They love taking on water for whatever reason, and vast quantities of it. When you look at all those cases, that really, they're taking, like a 10,000 gallon tank. The billabong and it's a fairly big billabong where that farm was. Dams are normally of reasonable size, and they're getting drained of their water. So you wonder for what purpose they're needing the water. And I don't think dam water would be that great to drink. So, and it's not like they just put a glass down and take up a sample of it for the scientists on board to have a look at. They're taking the whole boxing match of water. And up in that area, some people believe that there's a UFO base in the Glass House Mountains in Queensland, as UFOs are seen entering the area, and the area is known to have a strange humming sound as well. So very, very interesting. And obviously they take cows, livestock, and obviously you could say humans as well. So the UFOs most certainly are thieves. They love to come and take all manner of things when they're in the area. So I want to thank you so much for joining me on episode 15, the adventures that we've had, travelled right across Australia, seen some interesting UFO encounters, terrifying, in very remote areas. So I'm about to go on holidays now for 4 weeks. So I won't be doing any more new episodes over that period of time, maybe 5 weeks by the time I get back. I'm off to Vietnam for a month to get away from the Australian winter and go somewhere nice and warm in Asia. So I'll be back after that holiday, and I look forward to bringing you many, many more interesting stories and experiences from the Australian UFO and ghosts and crypto. We'll keep looking for whatever we can find out there. So in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.